There's this phrase that I think of from time to time: all theology is biography. And the idea behind it is that the life experiences that we go through, everything that compounds and compiles to become our personal story, really does shape the ways that we talk about and think about God. And I think that's obviously true if we reflect on our personal story. Our triumphs, our struggles, ups and downs in our life all import themselves into how we think about God. But I also think we start to see that reflected in Scripture, particularly when you look at a book like the letter James. Now, church history would tell us that the letter James was written by the brother of Jesus. That's somewhat speculative. We can't say that for sure, although we do have references in the Gospels to Jesus having a brother named James, and it's pretty reasonable for a number of reasons to think that this book was written by that person. I'll put a link down in the description below to a sermon where I talk about some of those questions of authorship. But what's really interesting today is this idea that the theology that James forms, which is very different than, say, the heady, esoteric theology of Paul. James is very grounded in the way that we treat people and the way that we think about our privilege in the world. I think that comes from the biography of being the brother of Jesus, growing up in a single-parent home, watching his brother move through the world, and then eventually coming around to faith that his brother really said he was who he was, and that maybe his way in the world was the way to follow. That history, that proximity to Jesus as children growing up and watching him, I think that really does shape the way that James forms his theology. And not only can we learn from that, I think it then can help us reflect on our personal stories and all the ways that our stories impact the way that we think about who God is. James doesn't contain a lot of theology, at least not the kind that Paul likes to do. Instead, the letter of James focuses on things like how we should talk to each other and how we should care for the least among us and how we should avoid showing favoritism. At one point, James even goes as far as to say that pure religion, real religion, as far as he's concerned, doesn't have to do with God talk at all. It's how we look after orphans and widows in their distress. That's what's important. And I have some thoughts about this. First, the idea that the kind of theological speculation that Paul engages in, the kind of stuff that I, let's be honest, really do like to read and study and write. But this idea that wondering about God is more important than wondering about what your neighbor needs, not only is that a false dichotomy, it honestly feels pretty un-Jesus-y, doesn't it? I love theology. I love studying and writing and thinking about God. I'm here for all the books and lectures I can get my hands on. But I'm also under no illusion that when I'm gone, any of my words will be remembered. The only thing that will outlive me, and probably you, is the way that we've loved the people near us and inspired more grace around us. And I'm good with that. And for me, the fact that James eventually comes around to Jesus, but does that primarily through his concern for his neighbors, well, this is perhaps why our space matters so much. Why proximity really is important in relationships. See, Paul did a lot of good thinking about Jesus, really good thinking about Jesus. A lot of work making sense of the Jesus story for all of us. And I am, like all of Christianity since, deeply indebted to all of Paul's thinking. But James actually grew up in the space with Jesus, relating to Jesus, wrestling with what he saw in Jesus, perhaps sometimes even rejecting what he heard from Jesus. But ultimately, James was too close to Jesus to forget it. And I think that matters sometimes. See, I think where you come from, where I come from, all of the stories that have led us here to this moment, all of the ways that we relate to our history, I think all of that over time actually does become us. And that doesn't mean that you can't overcome those relations. Doesn't mean you can't rise above them. It just means that they are part of you. Just like my mom and my dad and my bedroom in the basement of the house that I grew up in are all still very much part of me, even when I forget it. The truth is, we don't know a lot about Jesus' childhood. But even the gaps that we don't know tell us something, I think. We know his father was there at his birth. We know his father was there when he was a young boy. But then after that, we also know it's always just Jesus and his mother and his brothers, his sisters that surround him. No dad. And sure, we are speculating now, but if James is the younger brother growing up, watching his family struggle in a single-parent home, and watching his mother grieve her loss, and watching his brother give himself away to care for others, struggling to make sense of all that, but then eventually coming around to the idea that this love he sees in Jesus is really the way to live. And perhaps, as they say, all theology is biography. And it's not just our best thinking that matters. It's our being in the space together. And proximity with the people that you want to be like that ultimately shapes us. See, I think James' theology was born from the same kind of summer spaces and childhood bedrooms and complicated memories that you and I share with our families as well. And I'm so glad that eventually he found a way to turn all of that back toward Jesus. Hey, look, if you made it through that video, thanks. Really appreciate the click and the time that you've given us to listen to some of the things that we're reflecting on here in the community. If you're interested in more of the work that Commons is doing, by all means, subscribe to the page, give us a like, throw a comment down below, but also check out our Discord, where we're inviting the community to have all kinds of different conversations about what it means to follow Jesus here in the modern world.